so glad that you could all come to be here. When I thought of how we could celebrate today, special day, I thought we needed to remember the Declaration of Independence. Not the Continental Congress, but the Declaration of Independence. So I thought we really needed a speaker, a historian, to share with us, remind us of how our nation began. And so I knew there was a historian in town, and he agreed to be our speaker. So today, I want you to help me. Well, first of all, in speaking with him, he said he received his doctorate in history from the University of Iowa, and he also teaches at Carl Sandburg. So I want you all to help me welcome Dr. David McCarter, who's going to speak to us about freedom's frontier, liberty's frontier. So I'll let him tell us about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I learned some things about the frontier in Illinois, some of which I knew, and some of which I needed refreshed on, and certainly the American Indian peoples at the area thought that George Washington Clark was quite a guy. They called him a great warrior. Yes. Very afraid of him, actually. I call this Freedom's Frontier, and can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. And I wonder, where do you begin with this? And a young friend of mine today, she said, well, what are you going to talk about today? And I said about the frontier, and she said, oh, what's that? So maybe that's a good place to start. What's that? Frontier in American life, there's other places that had frontiers, and you might talk about it differently. But it was that line, running north and south, kind of, an imaginary line. But on maps, it was used to separate what they called settled land from wilderness, or maybe places where white European type people were, as opposed to American Indian people, that sort of thing. And so it's figured into American life in a lot of ways. And in my young life, when I was a boy, it was figured into by the TV show Daniel Boone. And I and my friends, we'd watch Daniel Boone after school. I think it was a rerun. And we would talk about it, and we would sometimes laugh about it, because it got pretty funny sometimes pretty ridiculous. And the one thing we always thought we remembered, because we heard this was so, we thought we remembered, is one of the introductory scenes early on in the series. You had Fess Parker, as Daniel Boone, there on a Kentucky mountain, in the Kentucky bluegrass, of course, and you had blue sky above. And all of a sudden, a small red and yellow white prop plane comes into view over the horizon and flies around. And I guess they didn't get the air clearance on that one, so that's a pretty good blooper for 60s television there. About 80 years before I was watching Daniel Boone, there was a very young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. He taught at the University of Wisconsin, and he was going to give a paper on the frontier in American history to a delegation of learned historians at the 1893 World Columbia Exposition. So for a young guy, this is a pretty big deal for him. And it was a bigger deal than he thought, because that paper would change from then up until the present day to how historians have thought about the frontier. Some of them have championed Turner's ideas, some of them have condemned Turner's ideas, but they're always there. You talk about the frontier, you have to talk about Frederick Jackson Turner. It's just have to do it. What Turner noticed was that when he looked at the 1890 U.S. Census, the Census Bureau said, we can no longer draw a line for the frontier. Now, true, there were vast areas of wilderness. But wherever you went, from south to north or from north to south, you're going to run into a ranch, or certainly a railroad. There was a transcontinental railroad, or a telegraph line, or a road, or something, right? It was broken up now. There wasn't a frontier. And for Turner, this was a big, big deal, because he thought that the frontier made America. In fact, it made Americans. People came over here as kind of wimpy, hoity-toity Europeans, and they got cast on the frontier. And they lost their European civilization, and they were able to build a new civilization. So it was a big deal. And he was thinking, how are we going to keep having an America if we're not making any more Americans? This is a troubling thing. He had an answer, but that was troubling to him. And for then on, people were using this frontier theory thesis. In the early decades, historians were using it, they're kind of trying to support his thesis. How local county governments changed the American frontier. How the railroad expanded the frontier. And on they would go with this, right? Well, in the 1980s, historians, maybe they got a little tired of that, I don't know, but they started to pick up the idea of the frontier and kind of turn it around and use it as in different ways, kind of a different lens to look on things. One historian said, we talk about the frontier as if it's always people. But as a matter of fact, there are animals and plant species that were European or even Asian that were going across the frontier without human intervention. If they're animals, they were moving themselves. If they were plants, they were, being blown by the wind or being carried by animals somehow. So that when white settlers got into Kentucky in the late 18th century, they found this wonderful grass, right? Kentucky bluegrass. Except it wasn't Kentucky bluegrass at all. It was a European grass that had overtaken native species. It was the biological frontier. There's another historian who said, we're really too caught up as historians in the line between things. And he says, what really matters is the middle ground, where white people and red people came together with the different resources they had, traded, and eventually came to depend upon each other, right? Because if they're making that over there, why are you going to bother to make it over here? It really had an effect on Indian clothes when you could buy blankets, and just stitch them up. You lost the old knack of how to make clothes because you could buy blankets at any time. It's a lot of time saved there. There's another historian, he liked that idea, but he said, the middle ground, they fought a lot there. And so he wrote a book called The Contested Ground that emphasized the wars that they were having on those middle grounds for contest and power. Today I was going to speak on a couple of frontiers. One was the western frontier. It's not only trans-Mississippi, but also went clear over into the Carolinas. And when the British decided to fight the War of Independence in the South, they found out there were frontiersmen that came out with the Kentucky long rifles and gave them some trouble in some areas called Kings Mountain and the Cowpens. And that was pretty good because the regular U.S. armies were getting beat up down there in the South. They really were. It was good these guys came along and helped out and helped the victory. But I decided, the talk was getting really kind of long, so I had to concentrate on something. And so I wanted to talk about a different frontier. I think a little bit more of an essential frontier, something we usually don't think of as a frontier, but that's what historians have been doing, right, with the frontier, picking it up and using it as a lens for something else. I'm going to talk about the frontier of the mind, a place where people were building arguments and reasons. And this was taking place in the very urbane, very coastal, very unfrontier town of Philadelphia. In fact, Philadelphia at the time was about the closest to the city that there was on any place in the North American continent, at about 18,000 people. And there, The most learned colonists at the time were meeting together, and they were talking about things like, why is the British Parliament taxing us so much? Why is the king not protecting us? Why are they not protecting us on the frontier? Well, what's going on with our rights of Englishmen? And they were the Continental Congress. And they included men like Charles Thomson. Some of you might have heard the name of Charles Thomson. It's a name that should be famous in American history, but unfortunately is not. Charles Thomson was a member of the Continental Congress, and he'd come to America as a boy with his father on a trip from Scotland, I believe. Well, his father died. And his father, of course, had a sum of money for his son, but somebody aboard stole it. And so he arrives in the New World fatherless and penniless. Fortunately, there were some strangers there that gave them the kindness of strangers and sent him off to a school for an education, and he became one of the finest Latin scholars in the New World at a time when it meant something to be a Latin scholar. Well, this is what it meant. When he came as an august Latin scholar to the Continental Congress, they were looking for a secretary, and they decided, there's the guy. There's the guy that's going to organize our journals for the day. There's the guy that's going to organize the correspondence we get. This is the guy that's going to read that correspondence and answer it for us. He is the man. And he did that well. He did it so well that when they became the Congress of the United States after independence, he stayed as their secretary. And it did a great, great service to the young country that the Journal of American History, the American Revolution notes as largely forgotten. And that's too bad. It is not forgotten in LaHarpe, Illinois, though, because Charles is a direct descendant of some of our neighbors here. Some living now and some recently departed, people like Charlene Bennett and Mike Bennett and Denise Thompson, this scholar of the American Revolution. They're directly descended by this person was important but forgotten. 1775 turned into 1776, and Thompson kept writing his letters and keeping his journals. And the Congress was deciding then that they tried to reconcile with the king a lot, and it wasn't working. It was not happening. They were singing, "We're freeborn Englishmen," but they weren't being treated that way. By June, the Congress, in fact, as we've heard, appointed a committee to announce the fact that the colonies were now free. And that committee devolved those responsibilities onto a committee of one. The young Thomas Jefferson, very learned, very aristocratic, member of Virginia. And he was to pen that document. And Jefferson, I'm going to concentrate on what he said, if you don't mind. He began his declaration with some very basic assumptions. That first was an assumption about men. Not people. We'd like for him to say people, but he didn't. He said men are all equal based upon their divine origin. Now, Jefferson means equality of right, not of ability or condition. Down in Albemarle County Courthouse, where he lived, they raced horses. And he knew, as much as anybody there, that there were some jockeys better than others, right? Some got more out of a horse than other people. They weren't all equal jockeys. There were different ones. He also knew, as the richest man of Albemarle County, and also the owner of people that didn't have a nickel to their name, that the fruits of this life, materially, did not devolve on all persons equally. There were differences. But what Jefferson would say is that the good jockeys and the bad jockeys, and the rich people and the poor people, as long as they were free, were equal in their right to have rights and to govern themselves. This was equal. Except, of course, for the black men and the Indian men and all women. They weren't included yet. Fortunately, where the seed of equality is planted, it tends to grow and expand, and that's what's happened in our country. The second assumption that Jefferson makes is that governments were made to protect people's rights. And if a government existed that didn't do that, he didn't have a lot of use for it. Okay? He just didn't. Third, he believed that a people could separate from a government that didn't protect its rights. also an unwritten assumption that Jefferson makes, that the British colonists were actually doing a pretty good job at running their provinces. They were doing a pretty good job of protecting their liberties. They were even doing a pretty good job of being good subjects of the king. They were productive. And they helped the king win the last war against the French. I mean, what more do you want, right? And he was troubled by the British government's response. In fact, he came up with 27 different grievances against the crown. I think 28 if you count the one that was scratched out. But not all of these hold as much water as others, we have to say. But if you look at them, they really boil down to about 3 different ways in which the crown was undermining the self-government of the colonies and the rights of the colonies. And it's really hard to dismiss these 3 things in total, okay? It really is. Some of them concern laws. That in order for a law of a province to be a law, the crown had to give its assent. That had to happen. And that the assemblies of the provinces were passing good laws, but the crown wasn't giving its assent. Really, for Jefferson, the one that really made him the angriest was this. That some of these laws had to do with the slave trade. They were passing laws to increase or establish tariffs on imported slaves. About 6 colonies had done that. Why did they do that? Well, you tax something more, you get less of it. Okay? They were trying to get less of it. And Jefferson, even though he was a slave owner, thought that was a good idea. In fact, he called, in the original Declaration, the slave trade a cruel war against humanity. And he blamed the king for keeping that going. He was really, really angry about it. Now, why were these laws disallowed? Well, there were people in England, important people, who made money off the slave trade. They didn't want that disallowed. Unfortunately for Jefferson's idea, there were people in the colonies that made money off the slave trade, and also off the importation of slaves. And so they disallowed this passage in the Declaration of Independence. It was cut out. But still, the Declaration contained a passage that condemned the king for refusing his assents, kind of generically, to all sorts of the most wholesome and necessary laws, which, of course, in Jefferson's mind, would have included raising the tariffs on slaves, right? That was a necessary and wholesome law. But there are a lot of laws, he says, that are not being given assent to. Now, what happens when those who govern aren't allowed to govern? It becomes voids in government, doesn't it? There's places they're not able to help because they can't get the laws passed. And so that's the second round of complaints with Jefferson. The crown has sought to kind of fill the voids in colonial government by making up his own government without consulting the assemblies. He did this in part by increasing the role of imperial government in the crown. How did he do that? Well, most famously, he had Parliament pass taxes without colonial assent. Not only that, he said he sent like hordes of imperial governmental officials to the New World to enforce these things and also to get paid for it. So that was kind of bad too. And then he also notes that the king got tired of local juries. He didn't say this is one of the things that he was upset about. The king had gotten tired of local juries that acquitted their neighbors and their friends in things like smuggling and other offenses against the Navigation Act. And so what did he do with those courts? Well, he said all cases having to do with trade are going to go over to the vice admiralty courts. And the vice admiralty courts, there weren't any juries. There really weren't any locals. It was mostly British judges passing being, giving the decision. Worst of all, for Jefferson, there were soldiers. He has all sorts of complaints about both soldiers, 4 actually. Now originally, why were there soldiers in the New World? Well, to protect the frontier. This was kind of vital. But as the French were less a problem on the frontier, and the crowds protesting British policy in the major cities of the East were more of a problem, those troops began to be shifted from the frontier areas out to the towns. They became less of protectors, they became more of policemen. And the worst thing for Jefferson and those who were like-minded was that the colonists had to pay for it. They had to build the barracks. They had to make sure that the British soldiers had enough to eat. And what happens if you don't do that? And some colonies decided that was a good way to do it. We just won't pass any provisions, so hey, we're out of it. But then the British could go up to local householders and say, here are the men assigned to your house. You house them, you feed them. And men with guns in your house, they tend to eat what they want. That's just true. And so that was a problem. Jefferson also then went to another area of complaints. He says the crown goes beyond this, putting soldiers among us. And he's trying to summon enforcers from outside the government to impose upon our rights. Some of the language here for us moderns is the most trouble. It has to do with things like race and nonviolence. And Jefferson talks about domestic insurrections. What is he talking about? He's talking about the crown, or actually the Virginia royal governor, Lord Dunsmore, proclaiming an announcement that if you are the slave of a rebel and you escape and you join his brigade to fight these rebels, you will be given your freedom. And for us, we're there, well, freedom for slaves, that's not a bad thing, is it? That's kind of a good thing. Also, Jefferson names the warfare of the merciless Indian savages. And we, with a different perspective on it, might say, well, they were kind of here first, right? Weren't the frontiersmen sometimes merciless and savage? Yeah, they kind of were. But we have to look at some other facts as well, though. Dunsmore and the other British officials did not give a rip about freeing African slaves. Most of them owned slaves, and they wanted them. Thank you very much. And if a slave tried to escape, they'd be shackled and beaten and these sort of things. They were concerned about using certain slaves against their political opponents. That was the deal. Also, there had been many conflicts between the white colonists and the Indians on the frontier. We heard about some of those. Part of the conflict between the crown and the settlers, in fact, was the fact that the king wanted to reserve the land from the Appalachians over for the Indians to preserve the peace. And the white settlers that wanted new farms didn't want to do that very badly. At the same time, once the fighting between the crown and the colonists commenced, the British officials along the western frontier started giving the tribes supplies and weapons and other support and told them, go attack your white neighbors. Do that. Go attack them. Go make war on them for us. And for Jefferson and the other men at the Continental Congress, what was the British government supposed to do? To get Indian peoples to attack the settlers? No, to defend the settlers, that was their job. So that was, they thought was quite harsh. And probably the worst thing was that the British Empire now hired troops from German states, like Hesse-Kassel, to help them fight. Now, this was nothing new for European states. You had a war, you hired people. That just did it, that's the way you did it. It killed most of your people, right? So this was kind of a win-win, paid this other country. But usually for Great Britain, it was done for who? Well, for foreigners. All of a sudden, you have British subjects having hired soldiers go against them, hired by the British government. Is this protecting us as colonists? Well, not really. So with the Declaration that Jefferson drew up, Congress was drawing a mental frontier, you might say, between the ruler and the people who no longer wanted to be ruled by him. And we're tired of this. You have broached the frontier of our rights, and you have crossed it. And we're not going to let you do that anymore. That wasn't the last time that would happen. More than a decade later, again in Philadelphia, delegates from 12 of the 13 states of the United States met together again. They wanted to give their citizens a better and a more stable and a more unified republic. Now, much of this Constitution concerns the structure of federal government, the Congress, the presidency, and the courts. But some of it concerns with something that some people thought was missing. And they said, you know, just like we needed a buffer between king and colony, we need a buffer between the constitutional government and the people to make sure our rights aren't violated. They wanted a Bill of Rights. They wanted a list of rights. And it was a really American thing to do. Now, in fact, one historian, Ray Raphael, he wonders, why didn't we just do it? You know, he says, 1606, before there were British colonies in America, they wrote a contract for those who were going to be coming to Virginia. And what does it start out with? A Bill of Rights. Rights you will have if you come to Virginia. And just about every writing like that included them. It was something American you did to make sure people had rights. But there were people that opposed that. One was James Madison, and he was the architect, not really the author, but the architect of the Constitution that kind of drew its outlines and got everybody together on the particulars by compromise and other reason. And he had some problems with the Bill of Rights. First problem he had, it was not necessary. Now, how can rights not be necessary? Well, he said, this is a constitution of enumerated powers. It doesn't pretend that the government has all power except for the places we're granted rights. It assumes that we have all powers except for the places where the government's granted powers, listed powers. If the power's not listed, the government doesn't have it, and you have a liberty in that case. That's just the way it is. Also, James Madison was a lawyer, and he knew what lawyers like to do. That in a few decades, you would have lawyers, if you had a Bill of Rights, that would insist that the right that everybody assumed we always had wasn't a right because it wasn't on the list, right? The lists are bad if your liberties are expansive. We don't want to narrow our liberties. However, and also there's some important rights that the Constitution already had. Habeas corpus, what does this mean? Well, they have to bring your body to a courtroom if they arrest you. No, that's not that important. Yes, it is. Without it, you can be lost in the judicial system forever, right? Nobody ever knows where you are, because they don't have to bring you anywhere. Here's a guy, this is what he did. You couldn't pass a law that attainder another person. This is kind of something the British Parliament did. And it was basically a law against a fellow member of Parliament. They kind of outlawed him. Took all of his property. Sometimes they'd take his life. You could just attainder someone. We're not going to do that in America. We just aren't going to do it. You could now prosecute or punish someone for actions they took before, because these actions violate a new law, ex post facto law. Yes, after the law is passed, then it's illegal. Before that, it's legal. You can't punish somebody for that. And then it was also stated in the Constitution that if you faced a criminal charge, it was your right to have a trial by jury. lot of delegates there, anti-federalists, LaHarpe called, were very, very uneasy about this new, stronger republic. And they thought a way to protect themselves was to add a lot of rights. Adding a lot of rights had a secondary benefit, a little bit underhanded. And the more rights you add, the more these rights have a tendency to gum up the works of the government. You know, so he's got lots and lots of different rights that sometimes are contradictory. It's hard to get things done. And so Madison and those who championed the Constitution with him decided, we're going to preempt this, okay? We're going to attach 10 amendments, 10 changes to the Constitution we can make that are going to enshrine some rights. That way, the delicate balances we've achieved in the Constitution won't be upset. We'll have a functioning government. And they said, you know, the second benefit is that if we're going to write the Bill of Rights, we can make sure it's a really good one. Really good essential rights in there. And they did that. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The First Amendment says that the government has no business interfering with how you practice religion. There's no establishment of religion. And secondly, you can say any opinion you want. And I would add for today, since there's some question, if there's something that other people think is fact, that you think is an opinion, you can say that. You can be wrong, that's possible, but you can still, it's still okay to say that. That is not against the law. A third thing you could do, along with this freedom of speech and press, is you could get together a group of like-minded people, and they could petition the government for something that's troubling them. And that's a right you have. Now, the second one is you can arm yourself, and there's a very simple logic to this that Madison would have used. He and most of the founders believed that local citizen militias were better than standing armies. And to have a citizen militia, what do you have to have? Well, you have to have armed citizens, right? They kind of go together. So you have the right to bear arms because you have a right to be in the citizens militia. This just kind of makes sense. A third thing, this goes back to the Declaration itself. Only the emergency of war should enable the government to compel you as a citizen to room and board soldiers. The British are invading from Canada, and we got to get troops up there, and we don't have time to build barracks. Okay, they can force you to take in soldiers. Other than that, they cannot. And of course, this goes back to one of the troubles that Jefferson had with the British long ago. Well, the government of the Republic shouldn't be able to do it either, right? Fourth, you're securing your property. The government can't search you, can't go through your papers, can't go through your belongings, can't go through your house and other properties, unless they have a reasonable belief that this would uncover evidence of a crime. And they had to swear to that. I believe that we will uncover evidence of a crime. And, the judge could ask him later, well, we didn't come up with any. How come you let this search go on? It's kind of your responsibility, bud. So you're secure in your property from that. The fifth goes along with it, right? You're secure from arbitrary legal action. If the government's convinced you've committed a crime, they can call a grand jury, and the grand jury members can say, we're certain that there's a crime here. And that doesn't end the process, right? That just begins the process of finding out whether you're guilty or innocent. Now, if you're found innocent, the government cannot try you again for the same crime. We had a young woman some years ago caught up in Italy where she kept getting tried over and over and over again for the death of the companion because the prosecutor could. Well, here you can't. You just can't do that. And if you're found innocent, Oh, I've already went there, I'm sorry. And during the trial, the government can't force you to give evidence against yourself. And you don't have to do that. Now, even if it's a civil action, and this amendment kind of strengthens the trial by jury thing, even a civil action, the lawsuit gives you the right to a trial by jury if it broaches the exorbitant sum of $20, which at the time was quite a chunk of change for a lot of people. As a defendant or a convicted criminal, you still have some rights. Don't just vanish. The state can't impose upon you an excessive bail. We'll just put a big bail on this person and won't bring them to trial. That'll work, right? Well, now you can't do that. And if you are found guilty and there's a fine attached, it can't be an excessive one. And if punishments are to be other than fines, the court can't just get together and make up cruel and unusual ones. Let's make this really, really painful because this is a really bad. No, you can't do that. You can't do that. Now, this brings us to Amendments 9 and 10, and these might have been the favorites of Madison. Why do I believe that? Well, there are some reasons, but they don't come from, reading the letters of Madison or other papers. I haven't done that. But I think they might have been, and I'll tell you why. The 9th one specified that just because a right's not named in the Bill of Rights, it doesn't mean it isn't a right. It may very well exist, okay? Anything we say here is not to say that there aren't other rights. And we found out that Jeff Madison, that's one reason he didn't really want a Bill of Rights at first, right? He didn't want to restrict the number of rights to just one's name. So I'm sure that he was really happy about that. Yeah, look at those other rights in there. And then 10, that the powers not granted to the federal government are reserved to the states. And he says, and behind the states, reserved to the people. And this well expresses that Madisonian idea behind the Constitution, doesn't it? Now, we have a limited government of enumerated powers. But the Constitution says, if the Constitution doesn't list the power, the government just doesn't have it. And we have liberty in that fact. Now, having been oppressed 2 decades before by a government across the waters, our founders sought to draw a line in the frontier between a legal and conceptual one. They wanted to redraw it for this new republic. Between governmental power, which under this new Constitution was going to be considerable, and the rights of the people. They wanted that new frontier. Now, it was not a frontier like Frederick Jackson Turner's, one that would be moving continually. It was supposed to stay there. It was supposed to protect the people. It was supposed to protect their rights. Now, these rights are worth protecting today. I was going to go on into how we can protect them. Very simple things. Voting, even when it's inconvenient. Serving on juries, even when it's inconvenient. Trying to do an honest job about those things. And I have much to say about them, but this is getting to be a long talk. So long talks are usually, their message is usually lost. So I just want to encourage us here on the 250th anniversary of our government to remember that rights are separate from policies. We can disagree on a lot of things. What should the government's role in healthcare be? The Illinois gas tax, up, down, or ended. Okay, we can disagree with those things, all right? But there are rights that we have that aren't red or blue, right? Or they're red, white, and blue. They're for all of us. And because we express different opinions of things, doesn't mean the other side should call us fascist and say those opinions should be outlawed. And I've heard that recently, and I find that very troubling because it's breaking down that barrier between government and the citizens. But we need to stand up for those barriers, for those frontiers, and say, these are our rights under this government. thanks a lot for listening. I know the time got kind of long there. I hope I made it a little briefer. Thanks for coming out. This is about like 4 times what I expected.